We were talking about Charlemagne, and I hope everybody still has your notes from that point. Great. So once again, Charlemagne is kind of the I think of him as sort of a pivot point in the development of the Western Europe as we know it. Certainly at the advent of the Renaissance and the Reformation, you know, that I think most of us have sort of a cultural image of what that time was like. And really that time begins with Charlemagne, because before that, what you have is the remnant of the old Roman Empire and the sort of crumbling remains of that. And it's really not until Charlemagne comes along that Europe takes on an identity of its own, separate from not the Byzantines. You know, I mean, there's a period of time there where there's the Byzantines, and then there's those other crazy people, you know, who don't know what they're doing. And once Charlemagne comes along, then they begin to get a sense of identity and how they are going to create a new political coherence that is not Rome and is not Byzantium. It's going to be its own thing, and that's really. But before we started, we were chatting, and I was saying I think that Charlemagne was certainly ambitious, but he was not corrupt or self-serving, I think, in the same way that some of the Byzantine emperors were, and some of the subsequent Holy Roman emperors will be, and some of the popes were. He really did take seriously his obligation to try to get some sort of central authority to get things organized for the benefit of the occupants of his territories. He really did want to make life better for people. And as you remember, I hope we talked about this before we kind of got cut off. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, Charlemagne is sort of the Frankish version of that, or Carolus Magnus was the Latin version, which of course was also how he was referred to at the time. But he needs to be differentiated from a lot of other Charleses that were running around in various roles of power, including his grandfather, who we remember as Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer. And he was the guy who stopped the Muslim advance at the Battle of Tours or Poitiers, depending on who's telling the story. So he was Charles Martel was the leader of the Frankish tribes, and the Frankish tribes were kind of a consortium. It's not just one tribe; it's a group of tribes, and in much the same way that we might say Native Americans or American Indians, lots of different tribes in that group, but they have some interests and some characteristics in common. One of those characteristics was that they were in the habit of electing their overall leader. And usually that meant their warlord, their person who was going to lead them in battle, the troops that they were sending. And that was not originally hereditary, but starting with Charles Martel, who hands off his power to Pepin the Short. And we sort of go back and forth between Charleses and Pepins. Charles names his son Pepin, and Pepin names his son Charles, and that's how it kind of goes down the generation. And the Pepins are always getting described in these sort of unflattering terms, because we've got a Pepin the Short and a Pepin the Bald and several other not very flattering Pepins. But Pepin the Short is the son of Charles Martel, and he also was a war leader, a battle leader, and he's the one who goes to northern Italy and defeats the Lombards, which is another northern group of tribes that kept invading Italy. And when Pepin the Short defeats the Lombards, he knows, he's smart enough to realize that he doesn't have either the military or the administrative resources to retain that property, to keep those lands under his own control. So he says, "Hi, Pope, guess what? You live here. I'm going to give these lands to you. They're yours now. They're your problem." But the Pope is happy about that because the Pope needs income. The Pope is trying to defend himself from these other secular forces. That's hard to do without an army. It's hard to do without money to pay an army. And so the Pope is happy to have these papal states. And this becomes known as the donation of Pepin. We've talked about that before. That makes the Pope, in reality, as well as in inspiration, a secular prince. Someone who has lands, who commands troops, who can kind of hold his own against attempted invasions. The other thing that was true about Charles and true about Pepin is that they were the active fighting commanders, but they were not the titular kings. The titular kings in the Frankish tribes at that point were known. Their nicknames were the do-nothing kings, and they basically enjoyed the prerogatives of royalty, but they sent other people to actually do anything that required authority, including fight their battles and including resolving administrative disputes. So Pepin, after he makes this donation to the Pope, goes to the Pope and says, I'm really tired of being called the head administrator. The mayor of the palace was his title, formal title. He says, I'm actually doing everything that a king does, and these other guys are not doing anything useful. And so how about if you instruct that I should be recognized as the actual king? And the Pope, looking over his new estate, says, that sounds good to me. And so at that point, the lineage of Charles, which comes out to be the Carolingians, okay, that Carolus name is what we now call this dynasty, is established as the formal kings of the Frankish tribes, who will, in pretty short order, become the emperors of Northern and Western Europe. So that is going to stand in a certain amount of tension with the tradition of the Frankish tribes, that they get together and decide who's the most competent general, basically, to defend them and to help them get new territories, and kind of elect that person by the consent of the sub-tribal leaders. And this is a shift that's happening culturally at a lot of different levels, about leadership and authority becoming hereditary, if the hereditary heir can maintain it. And so what happens is it'll last for a couple of generations, and then you'll get somebody who's really incompetent, and they get assassinated or taken prisoner or thrown out in one way or another, and somebody else takes over because they're more able to do it, and everybody's fine with that. There's not a sense of, that's awful, we need to go back to the true line. The true line is only true as long as they're good at it. Okay, okay, so basically Charles the Great, Charlemagne, is going to follow in the footsteps of his grandfather and his father, in that he's going to be all of his life at war. basically. He's going to be a military leader for the entire duration of his career, because what the thing that a responsible king does is that he maintains and expands the borders of his territory. That's his job. And so Charlemagne is always going to take that very seriously. And there are always going to be people attacking him around the edges. And so he's going to go and defend his borders and also push them farther back. And we'll see how that works, particularly in Spain in a minute here. But Charlemagne is a convinced Roman Christian. Okay. Now remember that a lot of these tribes around the edges, including the Visigoths in Spain, were originally evangelized by Arians, by people who were not particularly committed to the idea of the Trinity. Charlemagne is a Trinitarian. Charlemagne is a Roman Christian with loyalty to the Pope. And he, of course, it is in his political interest to understand the Pope in Rome, the Bishop of Rome, as superior to any other authority in the church. Because where are all the other authorities of the church? To the east, right, in Byzantium. So there is no way in which it makes sense for Charlemagne to take any of their authority seriously. He wants the Pope to be in charge. And he's going to do everything he can to support the Pope being in charge. And that relationship is going to be reciprocal, because it's in the Pope's interest for the person who has the most power in Western Europe to believe that the Pope is superior to any other authority in the church, right? So it's kind of one hand washes the other sort of thing. So in addition to conquering those territories, Charlemagne is going to evangelize them in the service of the Roman Catholic Church, the Trinitarian Roman Catholic Church. And this is partly because he is a true believer, in the sense that he understands his authority and his victories to be by the grace of God. He understands that he is in this position as a servant of God. And part of this is because it's now been 700 years since everybody was expecting the return of Jesus any minute, right? Nobody's really expecting the return of Jesus any minute. And so what that means is that the Christian church has to find a way of organizing itself for the long haul, and has to come to terms with what is the nature of secular government for the long haul. You can't say, well, don't worry about getting married because it's not going to be that long, right? No, we need marriage laws. We need inheritance laws. We need to figure out how we're going to run this thing for a long time, because yeah, maybe Jesus is coming someday, but who knows? In the meantime, we have a kingdom to run, right? So his mission, he really understands that he has an assignment from God, that the reason he has this power is that God wants him to create the city of God. If you remember, Augustine, as the Vandals are beating on his door in North Africa, is writing this treatise about what is the city supposed to look like if it's going to be Christian, if it's really going to reflect the values that a Christian society should honor. And Augustine now was nice, but he was a priest, so people only cared to a certain extent what he thought about the thing. For Charlemagne, it really makes a difference in what he's trying to accomplish, that he sees himself as assigned and put into this role in order to carry forward that vision of creating the city of God. And what that means in part is the welfare of God's people is under his control, and he's accountable for expanding that welfare, for increasing their well-being. and protecting them. You know, he has no illusions about equality. He's not trying to bring about democracy or anything, but he is saying, you know, it is not my job, as opposed to the do-nothing kings of recent experience, not my job to just wander around being royal. You know, my job is to actually use this power for the benefit of everybody. And partly that means having an orderly system of social structure so that people know their place. And when everybody understands their place and is in their place, then you will have peace and prosperity. You know, I mean, if you listen to John's sermon a week ago, last week, remember that the whole idea of covenant comes out of how you are assigned control over the land. And this is exactly the time period where this is evolving, that, okay, God gives the king the power, the authority, and then the king gives that authority to people under him, and they give that authority to people under them. And there's a whole like org chart of descent of who's in charge. But actually nobody below the king owns anything, and the king only owns it because he can defend it, you know, because he can take it back if someone else tries to take it. But all the rest of it, the king is assigning responsibility and benefit from that land to another person for some period of time. And it's in their interest for that time period to be as long as possible, because in order to grow a crop, you need that land for a year at least, right? In order to have, you know, herds reproduce, you need that land for multiple years. So there's this interest in creating stability. But yet, if you don't make good use of the land, if you're letting it go to waste, then they can take it back. If you fail to provide what is your responsibility to provide, whether that's military service or whether that's money or resources, then whoever's above you again can take it back. So there's always this balance between, you know, is the person who's the higher up getting what they need, and is the person who's in direct management, do they have enough control to make it productive? You know, that sort of back and forth. But that idea that you're in charge in order for it to be fruitful, you're in charge in order for it to be productive, and if that doesn't happen, you don't own that land. It's not yours to waste if you want to. You're only given the use of it, the covenant use of it, as long as you're using it in a productive way. Does that make sense? Because it's a little different from the way we think about land, and that, you know, that question of can you own land has real implications for democracy. We'll see way down the road. So that system of personal loyalty and holding land from someone who is over you in authority is basically the heart of the feudal system. That is what is it's been coming into being, but it's being formalized under Charlemagne. The vision of how this is going to work, so that there is a sustainable social structure that can allow for the expansion of the kingdom and the well-being of the people in it over time. That's what's being formalized here, and with the idea that this is how God wants it. You know, there is a theological strand running through this whole thing that says this works because this is how God has designed it, and God is the overall head of the whole thing anyway. So that there is there is a shift from hereditary loyalty where people in your family, in your descent, have a right to the resources of the tribe, even if they are corrupt, even if they are incompetent, to a more sort of performance-based kind of thing where you hold your resources by the grace of whoever's above you, and they can always take that back if you screw up. And there is no enduring right that you have beyond your loyalty to them and their loyalty to you. And that is something of a shift. So one of the ways in which that's going to be easier for the people at the upper levels of authority is if you have established standards of things like weights and measures and coinage. So this is kind of a throwback to the Roman Empire. The last people that did this competently were the Romans. But Charlemagne is going back to, you know, the measure is the measure, whether you're in Frankish territory or Alemannic territory or Italian territory, wherever you are, it's going to be the same thing. And he's going to try to do the same thing with coinage, that, you know, this coin is worth a loaf of bread no matter where you go. And that's always a struggle. If you think about it, even today with our computers and everything, you still have to change money, you know, when you go from one country to another. And there's a lot of opportunity for margins in there. You know, people can make money by shifting that kind of thing around. Even more so when it's from one town to the next, you know, that the weight is different and the coins are different and whatever. And the other thing he really wants to do is to protect merchants and protect trade. So trying to keep order such that you can travel with trade goods and hopefully arrive where you're going without getting robbed on the way. That becomes then the task of the local person who's in charge. And if they're failing at it, if they're corrupt, if they're getting a percentage of the take by allowing the robbers to operate, then the upper authority of the royal administration is going to come down on you. And that would be a reason why you might be deprived of your office or your, you know, being in charge of the town or whatever. If you're not helping to establish the kind of order that Charlemagne is going for. And to a large extent, in the areas that he really controlled reliably, it worked. He made a pretty good job of it. He also was very committed to learning, even though he himself was not a particularly learned person. He felt badly about that. He actually, apparently, at least according to some biographers, kept a book of writing exercises beside his bed, and he tried every night, you know, before he went to sleep or whatever, to learn to write, because he never had learned to write. And he wasn't particularly successful in himself, but what he did do was to be a patron of learning and to sponsor a lot of scholarship and the building of schools. And we'll talk some more about what that looked like. But he also in addition to standardizing things like weights and coinage, he also wanted to standardize the church. He wanted to standardize the liturgy. He wanted to standardize the Latin that was used in the church. So all of those things, on the one hand, he's kind of a control freak. On the other hand, what he's trying to do is set up a society that is dependable, so that people can know what's going on and make plans and carry them out and have predictable, prosperous lives. So both of those things. He is 26, something like that, when Pepin the Short dies. He's not very old, and his only surviving brother, Carloman, is only 17. Originally, what Pepin the Short tries to do is to say, I am leaving my kingship, my realm, to both of my sons jointly. All right, so this is a bit different from what was known as partible inheritance, where you'd say, okay, this one gets this part of France and this one gets this part of Italy, and you divide it up. And then you have two different kingdoms with two different kings. No, Pepin the Short is trying to do something different. He's saying there's going to be one king, but you're both going to be it. And you're both in charge of the whole realm. So don't split it up. And really, there was enough to do militarily that worked, because there were a number of armies at war on a number of different fronts. The problem was Carloman was only 17, so he was barely able to, lead an army or be a general or anything. And then he died not that long afterwards, about 3 years later. Yeah, in 771 he dies. So that left Charlemagne with the whole shebang, which in one way is good, because then he doesn't have to negotiate with Carloman about what he wants to do. But in another way, he's lost a reliable proxy. He's lost his general that he could count on. So then it becomes Charlemagne's job to sort of be everywhere all at once, and that is going to take a toll on him over the course of his life. Going back to the scholarship piece, he is at one point in let me see if I can figure out when this was. Yeah, in 781, so 10 years after Carloman's death. So he's been in charge for a while. This religious scholar, he's sometimes called a monk, but he actually wasn't a monk. He was not a monk and he was not a priest. Alcuin passes through where Charlemagne is fighting at the time, on his way back to England, where he was from. He was visiting the Pope on behalf of the English authorities. And Charlemagne is so impressed with his learning that he says, I want you to come and set up a school for my kids and the royal, the community of royal children in Aachen. And Aachen is the city more commonly known as Aix-la-Chapelle today, where Charlemagne had basically his headquarters. It was the place he went home to when he wasn't fighting somewhere. I get the feeling that Charlemagne was not someone who took no for an answer very easily. So Alcuin goes back with him to Aachen and sets up a school for his kids and the other royal families, and does a lot of scholarship and research. He gets a lot of important texts copied, and he helps develop and popularize Carolingian minuscule, which if you have any connection with orthography, it's the ancestor of the script we use today. And if you can imagine, it involved the creation of lowercase letters. Before Carolingian minuscule, everything's written in capital letters, and there are no or very unreliable spaces between words. So if you can imagine all capital letters all in a string, trying to read that has got to be just about impossible. So they develop the spaces between each word and capital letters to be used for titles and beginnings of sentences and stuff like that. And also the use of the question mark. Alcuin is one of the first people who uses a question mark at the end of an interrogative sentence. It doesn't look like our question mark, but that's what it is. He he originates that. So Charlemagne also, oh, sorry, Sue, yes.
Is that in Latin?
Latin, yes, that's the language that's being written, yes. But it's just a whole lot easier to read when you have, and it's you know, when we think of Latin, we think of the very angular letters where the U looks like a V. And one of the differences with Carolingian minuscule is the roundedness of the letters, which makes them less easy to incise or engrave, but easier to write with a pen. So, you know, the question is, what do you expect? What is the most enduring medium on which the script is going to be written? If it's stone, then the angular Latin is easier. If it's parchment and ink, then the rounded script is easier. So it's also depends on what medium you're looking at. Yes, Mike.
Does this guy Akun or whatever, does he have a team of a group of scribes? Does he recruit them and train them? And is there like a guild or?
He does attract a group of you might say like graduate students, you know, a group of scholars that want to study with him, but then they become his instructors too, like the children of the nobility and stuff at the school at Aachen. But the other thing he does is he travels around to monasteries and he instructs the monks at the monasteries what to copy. You know, he looks at the manuscripts they have and he says, this is important, you should be copying this. And then he teaches them to use the Carolingian minuscule, advocates for the use of that, so that the copies that they produce are more legible than the ones that they might be copying from. So he is not personally overseeing a team of scribes. He's basically giving instructions to local monasteries that are engaged in this process. But he does build a community of scholarship in Aachen as part of this school. Does that make sense? So he is a very busy guy. And we'll talk some more about him in a minute. So that process by which the Frankish tribes were accustomed to selecting their general, Charlemagne very wisely does not seek to abolish it. He turns it into a kind of cabinet, a kind of council to the king. So there's no question that they're going to unelect him, and he's militarily successful enough that they wouldn't have been wanting to unelect him anyway. But he kind of transforms their role into that of trusted advisors and people that he can both ask for advice from, but then also send out to implement his instructions. So he kind of shifts that role into a subsidiary group, which is new. He also continues to cultivate a relationship of mutual support with the Pope, and we'll see how that works in a minute. But it's there from the beginning, because as I said, they both recognize that they're better off with each other's support than they are being in competition with each other, or giving the other any reason to side with the Byzantine Empire over against the other powers in Western Europe, right? So even though the theological split won't come until 1054, the political split is becoming irretrievable as Charlemagne establishes a Holy Roman Empire, right? That a counter institution, a counter administration that does not see itself as owing anything to the Byzantine powers, any loyalty or submission or anything. If anything, sees itself in competition with them, right? Also happening at this time, well, all right, wait a minute, let me do this in order so I don't get lost here. Charlemagne has, over the course of his life, 4 wives. The first one was a completely political alliance that he set aside a year after it was formed. So there were no children that resulted from that alliance. He also has 10 recognized concubines, that is to say, women who were acknowledged as mothers of his children. He has 18 children, but the only son that survives to inherit from him is a guy called Louis the Pious, who grows up, as you might imagine, to be a very committed and observant Christian. He does have several surviving daughters, and the interesting thing about them is they tend to end up being abbesses. So they cannot inherit kingdoms, but they can inherit very powerful, prosperous abbeys. And so they go into the church, because if you're Charlemagne's daughter, there's nobody powerful enough for you to marry, right? But if you are a woman of intelligence, which of course many of them were, educated, what can you do? Well, you can run a big community if you're an abbess. So that's what a number of them were. Okay, so in 793, I just want to bookmark this. 793 is the first Viking raid at Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England. So we're getting ready to have the Vikings begin to play a role in the evolution of the European monarchies and military situation. And this is during Charlemagne's administration, so that there's kind of an overlap between that and the presence of the Vikings. But more importantly, in 797, Barcelona falls to the Frankish forces. So going all the way back to his grandfather, to Charles Martel at Tours, right? There's always been this pressure from the Muslim forces up from Spain. And here is where, let me put our little map on the screen. I know you got this in black and white in your notes, but I think it's more helpful to see it in color. So if you look down here to the southwest, this is what they're calling on this map the Emirate of Cordoba, which is the Muslim power there on the Iberian Peninsula. And just notice the little pink area, this area all the way up to the north is the Kingdom of Asturias, and that is the kingdom that never becomes Muslim. The Christian holdouts are all up here in this pink area for a long time, but it does connect right there, and there's a little connection there to the Orange Frankish Empire. And so there's always going to be collusion and cooperation between these two groups to try to push the orange down into the brown, to expand the borders of the Frankish Empire into Cordoba. And so and they don't even have Barcelona on this map, but it's over here, I think. That they begin to be successful is what happens under Charlemagne's leadership. And it's kind of like a Western crusade. I mean, there's the same impulse to remove the power of the infidels from the kingdom of the Roman Catholic Empire. So just as much as people are trying to sail around down there to the south to get to Jerusalem, they're closer to home. There's also a problem with the Muslims, and Charlemagne is going to be much more concerned with this border than he's going to be with anything having to do with the Crusades. When Barcelona is taken, one of the interesting footnotes of that is that the Caliph of Baghdad, so these people are in communication, obviously, with the rest of the Muslim empire. At that point, the Caliph, who is all the way over in Baghdad, presents Charlemagne, I think this is funny, with an Asian elephant and a clock. These are the two things that seem distinctive to him about the Muslim empire is they've developed this mechanical device. They were great clockmakers, and also they have elephants, which is not something that is well known in Europe. So, but there's a sense that the Muslim empire now regards the Frankish Empire or the Holy Roman Empire, either way, as a thing in itself, as an entity that is worthy of having diplomatic relationships with, without going through Constantinople, without imagining that the Byzantine Empire has anything to say about it, right? So you now have a three-way thing: the Byzantine Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Muslim Empire. Three different players, as opposed to the Byzantine Empire with these kind of weird folks off to the north, right? So that's kind of a change in the status of the chess game, if you will. During what's called the Taifa period, remember when Spain gets broken up into all these little Muslim kingdoms that are sort of constantly raiding each other and constantly at war with each other. One of the things that especially the northern ones do is they say, aha, we will make a temporary alliance with the Frankish forces, and we will get them to come in and help us defeat our enemies. This never ends well for the Muslim forces that want to do this. What happens is they bring in the Franks, and either the Franks get defeated, which means that the Muslims who brought them in get defeated and the other Muslims win, or if they actually manage to defeat the people they were going to be attacking, the Franks take over everything. Charlemagne just pushes the borders south and they all become Christian, whether they thought they were going to or not. So that allows him to keep continually expanding his empire to the south, and that is the beginning of the process that in 1492 will be completed, which is called the Reconquista, the reconquering of the Iberian Peninsula for Christianity. And this time, as opposed to the Visigoths, who were Arians, this time it's Roman Christianity, it's Trinitarian Christianity. And this is one of the reasons why when we get the Spanish Inquisition, it's going to be particularly fierce, because there's still that sort of remnant of Visigothic Arianism in the DNA of Spanish Christianity. Okay, so yeah, he's at war all the time, up here in the north, near his capital with the Western Slavs and Saxony. He's to the east with the Avars and the Southern Slavs down here, and then to the south with the remnants of the Byzantine Empire and the Lombards in Italy around Rome. So while he's doing all this military conquering, he's also doing forcible conversions. He's also saying, you can get baptized or you can die. Those are your choices. And so he is expanding the Roman Catholic Empire in that way as well. Okay, so in 799, well, in 795, the Pope Adrian I dies, and he was the first non-Greek pope Now, if you remember, for a long time, the Byzantines were deciding who was going to be Pope. They were assigning the popes, the Bishop of Rome. The last Greek Pope is Zachary, and he's 741 to 752. And then Adrian the First has the longest papacy until modern times. And he dies in 795. He was a Roman patrician. He was from the upper classes of Roman Italian society. So when he is succeeded very quickly and popularly by Leo III. And Leo III was not of the patrician class. And so, but neither was he Greek. So he did not enjoy the protection of the Byzantine Empire. But he also was unpopular with the upper classes of Rome who had supported Adrian and did not approve of his elevation to the papacy. In 799, he is attacked, I mean, physically attacked. And the goal of the attackers is apparently not so much to kill him as they were going to cut out his tongue and cut off his hands. And I think also it's a little obscure, but I think the implication is castrate him, because if they did those things, then he would not be qualified to be Pope anymore, and he could be deposed and replaced with someone else because they didn't approve of his being Pope, these attackers. And the people who were with him at that time were a couple of ambassadors from Charlemagne's court, called Missi Dominici. And they were sort of resident ambassadors. They weren't just sent there on a mission, for a visit. They were expected to be part of the Pope's court on an ongoing basis. So they owed no allegiance to the Byzantines, and they owed no allegiance to Roman upper class society. So they actually brought their troops and rescued him. And he fled at that point, Leo did, to Charlemagne's camp at Paderborn. And I'm not sure where Paderborn is, but I think it must not be far from Rome. He must have been down around the coast somewhere here. Because he wasn't convinced that he could be safe in Rome. The other thing was that Leo was accused by his opposition of adultery and perjury, that he had somehow sworn a false oath or something. It looks to me like that was kind of made up as another attempt to get him out of office. But their idea was they wanted him to have a trial in Rome on these charges. And he's like, I won't get a fair trial in Rome. And so Charlemagne says, okay, fine, don't worry about it. Go back to Rome. I'll be right there. Let me finish what I'm doing and I'll come. And your trial will take place under my supervision. So that's what happens. Leo is escorted back to Rome, and Charlemagne follows him. And so when Charlemagne gets there, they have a trial. And Leo does this thing where he takes a solemn oath and calls down curses on himself if he's lying, kind of thing, and declares his innocence. And that then by Charlemagne's authority, because nothing bad happens to him, lightning doesn't strike him or whatever, the accusers are then exiled because he took this oath. So this is right before Christmas in the year 800. And so 2 days later, they're having Christmas Mass at the cathedral, and Charlemagne is there, and it just so happens that there's this crown on the altar, and much to everyone's surprise, theoretically, Leo takes the crown and he uses it to crown Charlemagne and proclaims him Holy Roman Emperor. And that's where that phrase gets started. Now, many historians would argue that there is no possibility that Charlemagne didn't know this was going to happen. But it was not announced. It was not a public coronation in the sense that everybody came expecting to see it. It was, at least for a lot of the people in attendance, it was a spontaneous thing, which did not allow for the development of public resistance. How Charlemagne felt about it, some of his biographers say, oh, he was reluctant, he didn't want this. You know, he wouldn't have shown up at the cathedral if he'd known it was going to happen. You know, he walked in and saw the crown sitting on the altar. I think he might have had a clue. But anyway, that's the story of how he gets to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. Now, remember that kings fairly, for a while now, have been anointed by bishops, right? Or the Pope, if the Pope happens to be handy. But there is this sense that you're not really a king if you don't have the support of the local bishop, which is fair enough, because it would be hard to be a king if you didn't have the support of the local bishop. So there's been this anointing thing going on. But this is not only is Leo doing Charlemagne solid by crowning him, he is also, by implication, reserving to the Pope the right to crown the Holy Roman Emperor, right? He's setting up a precedent that this is how it's done, right? And I don't care if you're 50 times Charlemagne's son and heir, and everybody wants, if you have not been crowned by the Pope, then you're not really the next Holy Roman Emperor, right? That's the claim that's being made on Leo's part when he does this. And so there's this this coming together of the power of the church and the power of the state in cooperation, but with neither one completely ceding ultimate authority to the other. It's always going to be a one hand washes the other kind of thing. All right. So in 813, Charlemagne realizes that Louis the Pious is his only legitimate son who has survived and is competent to take over and rule. So he actually has him crowned co-emperor with Charlemagne himself. You know, partly with the thought of that makes it easier for him to command troops in the field and be assist him in this constant process of war, but also that it kind of makes an end run around any other process that might be proposed in terms of who should be his successor, right? It kind of nails that successor question down. And in fact, he dies the following year in Aachen. So it was none too soon that he did that. Let me just see if there's anything about the biography of Charlemagne that we don't understand, because I want to go back and talk a little bit more about Alcuin and also about how that Holy Roman Emperor thing came about. Everybody good? You know, I am going to, does anybody need this map anymore now that you've kind of seen it? Okay, because I'm going to go back to where I can see you. Yeah, Kay.
On the map, the yellow thing, what is that? Maybe I missed it, but
okay,
just to the east of the Holy Roman Empire, there's a yellow chunk about where Turkey ought to be, I imagine.
Yeah. Oh yeah, right. Hang on. There we go. That is contested. It was going back and forth between the Avars and the Franks, and also that little brown area there. That the Muslims had established what they called a khanate, kind of a colony, there just past Constantinople. They couldn't take Constantinople at that point, but they'd taken this territory. So they were also ambitious to establish themselves in this contested area. And so that's why it's not labeled, because it kind of keeps going back and forth from the Franks to the pagans to the Muslims. And you really can't call it any of the above at this point.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Same with the blue there in Italy.
Yeah, well, that is contested more between the Franks, the Byzantines, and the Lombards. That's where the papal states are. And so those are also, it'll be a while before the Western Europeans succeed in kicking the Byzantines totally out of Italy. Ravenna will be the last stand, so to speak. But yes, that's very much contested at this time too.
Question?
If
Yeah.
I may add, that map
Please.
perfectly articulates Machiavelli, because the son that was the Borgia, Cesare Borgia,
Yeah.
who that particular, because he used the Franks to come in and try and control Rome.
Yep.
That map shows it perfectly.
Yes, and we will come back to the papal lineages, shall we say, in a little while, because the papacy itself becomes hereditary in a certain way after a while. So, but yes, exactly right. Anything else about the map?
No.
All right. So the problem with this is I can't see all of you. So if someone's waving at me, it's hard for me to know. Okay, everybody good? All right, so first I want to talk a little bit about Empress Irene in the Byzantine Empire, because they do have for a few years, they have this female emperor. She is born, as many people of power in the Byzantine Empire are in Athens, and she marries Emperor Leo IV. And when he dies in 780, their child is young. He's only 9 or something like that. Well, yeah, he would be 771 to 780. He's 9. And so she is regent for him in his name until 790, at which point he's 19. He's ready to be done with her, and he has her removed as regent, but she's not willing to go quietly. And so she actually makes a comeback. She gets herself reinstalled as regent, which argues to me that he may not have been all that competent. I don't know that much about him, but he couldn't get rid of his mom. So he has another 5 years as regent, at which point he would have been 24, going on 25. He wants to get rid of her again, and she actually arranges for him to be blinded so that he's not qualified to be emperor. And either he accidentally dies from those wounds, or she actually has him killed. One of the two, it's not clear. But anyway, in 797, she declares herself the sole ruler and the first empress. And she actually is in that position between 797 and 802. So what happens while she is the empress of Byzantium?
Charlemagne's crowned.
Charlemagne is crowned, exactly right. And one of the arguments for the legitimacy of his being crowned is that there is no emperor in Byzantium at that time, right? Even if they are the heirs of Rome, they've completely lost it. They have no one in charge, because obviously it can't be a woman, right? So there's this little window where they can make the argument that it's legitimate to crown an emperor in the West, because there is no emperor in the East. And that's part of the argument, and that's one of the reasons why she is significant. And it also gives rise to another claim that the Byzantine Christianity is heretical because it allowed for a woman emperor. And so that can't be good theology either, right? It's not good politics and not good theology. And so that's how come that it was that particular moment that the Western side made their move. Right? Okay, and then just a little more about Alcuin, because he is really cool. I really like him. So he is a religious leader and a teacher, but he's not a monk and not a priest. So he's not ordained. And what that means is he doesn't owe obedience to either a particular monastery or monastic order or a particular bishop. He's really kind of a free range scholar is what he is. And that's what Charlemagne likes about him, is kind of a free range scholar. So he's known as the intellectual leader of the Carolingian Renaissance. And there is, because Charlemagne is such a patron of scholarship, more scholarship than the arts, actually. And I don't know, Peggy, if there is a notable art of Charlemagne's age, but what you hear about more, is there?
Yeah, just very Carolingian art is some of the most important of the Middle Ages.
Cool. So can you give us a quick example of like what would be typical of that?
Well, in terms of the art of manuscripts,
well, you're right,
along with the new script and the legibility and the there's this whole imagery that particularly revived a classical style. He went out of his way to align himself with the sort of classical past, the Greco-Roman past,
right.
where medieval art before him was very openly rejecting that pagan art of the classical past, because he wanted to be thought of in the lineage of Roman emperors. He needed to make that connection. So stylistically, it revived a lot of the realism that early medieval art rejected, because they were going for abstraction where they thought realism looked pagan because it looked Greco-Roman. So he's reviving that. Architecturally, it's also a big revival of Roman architectural style as well. The accurate details of Roman architecture in terms of the styles of the capitals and just sort of a lot of little stylistic details. So Carolingian art really does go out of its way to kind of jump over the earlier medieval and look back to the classical past. And it's usually scholars talk about it as, his attempt to align himself with that tradition. Yeah.
Right. So not so much creative as retrieving something.
Right. It's revivalist.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not totally, but it's clearly noticeable when you put one of his manuscripts against, say, that, the earlier insular style of the British manuscripts, which were very abstract and ornate and curvilinear. And there's a simplification in his work and a clarity and a return to a kind of realism that you didn't see before. And that's going to disappear somewhat after him. But during that period, and particularly the books, his personal gospel books, and the Coronation Gospel, which is a gospel book that was used for all of the coronations from that point on. It was created for Charlemagne, but it was used from then on for the coronation for Holy Roman emperors. And so they all used this book that had that connection to the Roman Empire, which is interesting historically.
So cool. Thank you. That's great. That's more than I knew about the art of that period. That's very cool. Right, we talked about the Carolingian minuscule. So Alcuin himself was born in the British Isles, and he comes to prominence at the cathedral school in York in Britain, and he speaking of throwing back to the classical tradition, he revived the division of the 7 liberal arts, the trivium, which was grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, which was arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, those areas of study which were laid out by the classical Greek scholars. Apparently there's a lot of political contention about whether the Bishop of York is an archbishop or not during this time. And so they send Alcuin to Rome, sort of an embassy to the Pope, to get the Pope to sign off on the idea that the guy in York is actually an archbishop, that York is its own archbishopric. And that's the journey that on his way home, Alcuin runs into Charlemagne, and Charlemagne says, listen, that little place at York is nothing compared to what I would like you to be running for me. And like I said, I don't think it was a very good idea to say no to Charlemagne. And so Alcuin does go with him back to Aachen and sets up this even larger school with even more scholars and even more power and even more resources than he had in York, where he both instructs the sons of the emperor and other royal kids. He also becomes an advisor, especially an intellectual advisor to Charlemagne. And like I said, he really, he kind of oversees some of this Renaissance activity, like reforming the scholarship in monasteries and trying to make their get their schools in the same way that he's trying to regularize weights and measures in the mass. Charlemagne also wants standardization in education. He wants all students to be learning the same kinds of things, and that's partly what Alcuin is doing on his behalf. But there's also some evidence that he worried about what Charlemagne thought about things, and so in 790, Alcuin does go back to Britain, and he kind of presents himself to King Ethelred there and says, you know, here's my resume of all the cool stuff that I've been doing over on the continent. Don't you want me to do that here? And Ethelred kind of says, no, not really. And so Alcuin says, fine, I'm going back to Aachen. You know, there's no point in staying here if you're not interested in what I might do. But also Charlemagne is urging him to come back because he's dealing with a heresy in Spain. And that heresy has to do with what's called adoptionism. And you sometimes hear this even today, that, you know, Jesus is adopted as nature, you know, that he's born to a human mother, and then God kind of reaches out and says, you are now my son, you know, when the Holy Spirit comes like a dove. And so there's one way of kind of grappling with the Trinity, if you will, that says, well, Jesus was a normal human being until some point. Maybe it was that day in the river when the dove landed on his head and the voice from the heavens said, you know, this is my son. At that point, then he became different from every other human being. He was adopted as something different, as God's representative, or God's self, or whatever. And that was declared, that idea, that way of dealing with the problem of the Trinity was declared a heresy. But it came to be very widespread in Spain. Now, why was it widespread in Spain? Well, 2 reasons. First of all, it helped the Christian apologists, scholars, missionaries, whatever, explain Christianity to the Muslims, because the Muslims have this very severe Unitarianism that says God has no other, God has no companion, God, there is nothing else like God. And so the Christians were saying, well, you know, that's true until God chose to make Jesus like him. And so that adoptionist theology worked in a little bit in trying to have a conversation with the Muslims. Also, it had echoes of the original Arianism that the Visigoths brought to Spain as, yes, Jesus was entirely human, and then something else happened. But he started out completely human, just like you and me. And that this was a heresy that Charlemagne was not interested in having take hold, right? So he calls Alcuin back because this is the smartest, you know, most literate guy he knows, kind of, and sends him to Spain, to Asturias, to that little pink kingdom on the northern edge, and says, you know, teach these people the right way to think about this. And so the Alcuin does that, and in fact dies in the service of Charlemagne. One of the more interesting things about him, though, and then we'll have time for some more questions, is that Alcuin advised Charlemagne to give up this idea of forcing people to be baptized. He taught that, you know, he says faith is a free act of the will, not a forced act. And so you have to appeal to people's conscience and not try to force them by violence. You can force people to be baptized, but you cannot force them to believe. And eventually Charlemagne did abolish the death penalty for people who chose to remain pagan. Not to say that they weren't under a disadvantage, but they weren't necessarily immediately put to death. So that there's just that little sprout of tolerance for intellectual integrity, you know, kind of breaking through the cracks of orthodoxy there, which is another reason why Alcuin is one of my cool guys. I think he was a fascinating character, and someone who, you know, I think of him as, you know, someone that Charlemagne admired and was intrigued by, and could never really wrap his mind around, you know, that he wasn't a scholar himself, Charlemagne. He wasn't widely literate, you know, he could read, but he wasn't a student, but he kind of wanted to be, or wished he had been. And in another historical situation where he hadn't felt like it was his job to be all the time at war, he might have been a scholar king. You know, I mean, he might have been able to pull that off, but it just wasn't in the cards for the era in which he came to power and what he was trying to accomplish. But something about it just captivated him, and he wanted to have it around, and he wanted to have it out there, and he wanted to have his kids educated. So Louis the Pious is a result of Alcuin's educational process. And we will talk some more about what comes of all that another time. So that's Charlemagne. We have a few minutes if you have questions about what's going on with him, or anything that we have. Yes, Kay, and then Peggy.
Probably not the most important thing about Charlemagne, but I'm curious. Did he have 4 wives at the same time, or
No.
were they one after another?
It was sequential.
Okay.
The first one he put aside after a year. I think the 2 middle ones died, predeceased him. And I think the last one survived him. But yeah, no, it was only one.
I was just curious about.
Yeah, right.
how many-
It
how
could
many-
easily have been otherwise,
Yeah.
you know, given the culture of the time, but no, they were sequential. Peggy and then Rayanne.
Okay, I just wanted to say one more thing about those Charlemagne manuscripts, the ones that were so impossible to read. It wasn't, certainly if you've seen them, and I've seen quite a few of them, it's not just that they are capital letters all in a line, which is hard enough. I mean, just sit down and type something sometime with no spaces, all capitals, and see how hard that is to read, even when the letters are clear. But in this case, the letters weren't clear simply because every region and little area had developed its own way of making a letter. There was no standardized way of making a letter, and one E might look nothing like another E. And the problem is that monks have been copying these things visually by hand, and half the time they couldn't read what they were writing, so they
didn't know what it said anyway, right?
Exactly, they were just guessing what it said, and it had become so corrupted that it was said that Charlemagne was fearful for people's souls because they weren't reading the real text, and they had to go back. They didn't retranslate because it wasn't a translation issue. It was a matter of going back far enough that someone could say, okay, this is what the really says. These are what the words really are. And it made huge change in everything, but it was quite chaotic. And apparently the texts were bizarre. What some of them were saying was just nonsensical. And some of them were actually even saying the opposite of what they really said. Instead of saying, do not do this, it said, do this. I mean, it was that sort of horrible situation before him.
And that was why having someone like Alcuin come along and say, okay, here in this monastery, you have these manuscripts that are reasonably accurate. Copy these guys. These other ones are completely corrupt. Don't copy them anymore. And help people sort out what was, worth saving or try to correct, the errors that had come in.
It was important that he had no allegiances. I don't think anybody could have done that job if they had those allegiances. I mean, that was such an important part of who he was, and gave him that freedom to, make
and credibility.
Right, credibility and freedom to make the best decision.
Right. Cool. All right, Rayanne. You're gonna have to unmute yourself there.
The heresy that you were talking about, was that attached to any economic things with people? I mean, I wouldn't think anybody would be all that upset about adoptive things. I would. Was there?
Well, what was it? Economic
or a vested interest?
Well, the Roman Catholic Church had a vested interest in the Trinity. I mean, that's what was really at stake. And as soon as you put in a wedge that says there was any moment at which Jesus was not actually God, there's a point of departure there for heresy as far as the Orthodox understanding of the Trinity is concerned. So I think this period, this is like the flowering of philosophy and scholarship in Andalusia, in the culture that was created on the Iberian Peninsula by this encounter between Muslim scholarship, Christian scholarship, and Jewish scholarship. And so there was all kinds of creative sparks flying in medicine and in mathematics, and so it, in some ways, it's not surprising to me that somebody said, well, here's a way of looking at this whole Trinity thing. Let's try this. I mean, that the intellectual culture would have been open to creative understandings in Andalusia. not so in Rome, not so in Aiken, not so in any part of the Holy Roman Empire. And this is a place where you can't lose track of the competition between Byzantium and Rome, because each of them was eager to find the other guilty of heresy.
Oh,
Right, because then they could claim, well, we're the real McCoy, and these other people have lost the way, right? So so there's always this tension about, and no, we're not advocating that heresy, and so when this started coming up among the Christians in Spain, it's like, no, we don't need another group of heretical Christians evangelizing some community and teaching them the wrong thing. We got to get in there and straighten this out before it becomes kind of a breakaway thing. And you have Muslim, Jews, and heretical Christians, and we have to struggle with all of them. We want to keep our Christians in a row so that we can continue to push southward in what kingdoms we're taking over. Right. Yes, Anna.
This is just schedule-y related.
Oh, good.
So next Wednesday, we have class on the 26th, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
But I have a note that we're not having class on June 2nd. Is that still true?
Well, I just was trying to figure a break for all of us in there, but since we kind of have had some, I don't need to not meet on June 2nd. So if everyone's up for it, let's just go ahead and assume that is a class.
And then I have them going through June 30.
Yeah.
Is that our last day, June 30?
Yes, that would be the last one for this.
I wondered because I know we missed something because of something, but you're going to work it all through and it'll all
right.
be
Well,
fine.
We'll figure it out. I mean, we're not going to get to the end of history anyway, so we'll just
that's
well,
That's okay.
I'm just trying to get us as far as the Reformation. That's my goal, because the Reformation's a whole kettle of fish, and we'll do that next fall. So yes, Jim.
Yeah, the popes at this time were not married, right? Or were they?
No, the popes have not been married officially almost since ever. And the bishops at this point are not married. And part of what's going to be standardized before too long, well, in the next couple centuries, is going to be priestly celibacy. At this point, priests are married.
Okay.
But not people who expect to rise in the hierarchy of the church.
Okay.
So popes, no. Now, does that mean they don't have kids? Does that mean they don't have mistresses? Not at all. But
Right.
they're not married.
Right. But so when Leo the Third
Mhm.
was accused of adultery, that meant he was messing with somebody's wife,
Correct.
legal spouse, then probably.
Correct.
Ah, okay.
Right. Yeah, it would be fornication if it was just him messing around and nobody really cared about that. So I'm assuming, I don't know the story well enough to know, but I'm assuming he was probably accused of adultery with the wife of somebody important. And that would make sense if it was the patrician class that was trying to get rid of him.
Yeah.
That they would have said he doesn't respect, the boundaries of our social structure, including the wives of important people like that. That's my guess. Yeah, Peggy.
I just had one question. I meant to ask it at the time and forgot. If he was not a patrician, was not popular, how did he ever get that job in the first place? I thought he didn't seem to have had anything that would have
Right.
gotten him into that position.
No, he was popular. That's the thing.
Oh,
He just not with the upper classes.
he was popular with the masses or something.
That's right. And I think he was popular with the internal administration of the church. Because the more upper class patrician the Pope was, the more they treated it like a secular cushy job, job. You know, the more they expected to be waited on, the more they functioned like a secular prince. And that did at times create resentment among the people that then had to do their work, you know, their actual work. And so it was a rushed thing. I know that. I mean, it was like he was elevated like 2 days after Adrian died or something. I mean, it was a very boom. This is the new guy. And that may have been partly because they didn't want some Greek to get back in. You know, I mean, it was kind of a new thing that this wasn't someone that was being sent from Constantinople. So they wanted to have someone in place before the guy could get off the ship, you know, to say, "Hi, I'm your new pope." But I think there was also, I mean, when we see like the Borgias and those people, there might also have been some person with family connections to Adrian who had his eye on the job. And so there may have been some urgency to get someone in there to avoid that as well. So yeah, I mean, Leo did have his supporters, because you're right, he couldn't have gotten the job if somebody wasn't on his side. But the folks who resented him had status and resources enough to arrange, you know, a direct bodily attack on him to try and disqualify him. Anything else about this? I mean, just in case you thought religion was dry, dusty stuff. Okay, all right. Well, then everybody have a great afternoon, and we will see you next week.
One of the biggest things I've learned from this class is that it wasn't just one central thing, and that so much culture happened because of the differences.